I'm now joined by Sener Akturk, who's in the studio. He's a senior fellow at the TRT World Research Centre, and he joins us now. Sener, good to have you back on the show. Now, Courtney was actually talking about sort of his self-imposed exile in the United States, but the ties between Fetullah Gulen and the United States don't just go back several years, do they?
They go back several decades. Now, the published sources on this, and they point to connections going back to the 1970s and even earlier, as I mentioned in our earlier discussion. It was part of the struggle against communism, and one of the people that has been under arrest in connection with the Gülenist conspiracy, for example, is a former Uzbek, Turkish intelligence officer and nationalist Enver Altaylı, through his connection to Ruzi Nazar, who was the CIA station chief in Turkey between 1959 and 1971, is currently under investigation as one of the leading connections between the then American Central Intelligence Agency and its connections in Turkey. Now, as I said, we cannot say outright that Gülenist organization is simply a foreign ploy, because as I mentioned, there was a domestic contradiction, and there were some domestic sources that also fed the Gülenist network in Turkey, including especially the 1980 military coup and the higher echelons of, at that time, also Turkish state. But that has came apart in the last decade, at least. And the reason for that, many of the Turkish officers that have been interviewed in this regard, I remember in one of the publications on this, they described the Gülenist network as America's Frankenstein. Now that's a metaphor that immediately resonates with many people who try to get at the geopolitical dimension of this organization. As many of our viewers are familiar with the metaphor of Frankenstein, it's something that you create for a certain function, for a certain purpose at a particular time in the 70s, 80s, to fight the Soviet threat, communism, and so on and so forth, but then it gets out of control. It gets out of control and becomes disastrous to its environment. That's one
kind of like the Mujahideen in probably Afghanistan.
Probably, which, of course, as we very well know, was nurtured, cultivated by the United States in the struggle against Soviet Union when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1978, which, by the way, as an interesting coincidence, was also instigated by a very tiny communist military coup attempt by Babrak Karmal. So it was actually the military putschists, the military coup plotters in Afghanistan, Babrak Karmal and his faction of revolutionary socialists, who called Andropov, at that time the KGB chief, and Brezhnev, the general secretary of the Communist Party, and invited Soviet army to Afghanistan at that time. But let me also mention, I know that we have very brief time, but let me also mention the domestic significance of this failed
just a
coup.
bit, because I really like the fact that you sort of brought up this analogy of Fetullah Gulen being America's Frankenstein. President Erdogan actually spoke about the mastermind behind the 2016 military attempted coup. This is what the Turkish president had to say. Let's take a listen. I'm going to get your opinion on it.
Kamu kurumlarını FETO'dan ve diğer terör örgütü sempatizanlarından
While clearing public institutions of FETO and other terror group sympathizers, it is important to prevent such groups from emerging again. Our main responsibility is to wipe out the environment that gave birth to and nurtured FETO.
President Erdogan saying never again. We've seen Turkey sort of present dossier after dossier to the U.S. officials. The U.S. Justice Department is basically saying that we don't have sufficient evidence. Sort of bring into what you said before about sort of the deeper ties going back decades. Is that really the only reason that we're not seeing any significant progress, at least from the Turkish perspective, on the extradition of Fetullah Gülen?
Right. Now, I think ultimately the judicial process is one dimension of this, but the point has to come when the American decision makers see the Gülenist network more as a liability than as an asset. Because that calculation, the cost-benefit calculation, is most likely what derives decision-making. Because coup plot, I mean, there is a massive amount of video footage, published documents, translated documents into English, edited books, journal articles by American, European, Turkish, Asian, and other scholars on this issue. There are, and this is not even a person who is an American citizen in the case of Gülen, let alone...
He's there on a temporary visa.
He's on a temporary visa.
On a green card.
On a green card, I believe. And I mean, if you think of any other corollary, any other parallel person of this kind of significance, it could have been it could have been facilitated. Now, of course, there is, as we all know, a major, let's not say chaos, but major disagreements between different departments of the United States government. Department of State, the presidency, the Congress, and so on and so forth. But again, I mean, think of all the cases opened on financial fraud issues regarding Gülen's schools, schools that were claimed to be inspired by him as part of his application to permanently reside in the United States. So these schools have been, yes, they have been linked to him in earlier periods. So there's this kind of very pragmatic way in which Gülen and the Gülenists claim all this network when it seems to be beneficial or necessary to a certain purpose, such as gaining residency and so on and so forth, and disavow it.
I have one more question for you, but let's just go back to our pictures and actually just talk on this. These are live pictures from Istanbul. I believe it's Istanbul's Atatürk Airport, which was another key target during the 15th of July coup attempt before Istanbul's new airport, which opened up earlier this year. Atatürk was the country's largest and busiest airport. President Erdogan is expected to land there in about 30 minutes after wrapping up his commemorative events in the nation's capital earlier today. Now, because of this, because it being the country's largest and busiest airport, it meant a lot for the coup plotters. But we're going to get to that in just a moment. Let's come back to Sener and continue our discussion. So basically what I'm understanding is that you're saying that Fetullah Gülen, in a way, still serves the U.S. interest.
I don't know. At least that because otherwise it's somewhat inexplicable, right? Unless he had some sort of immunity of sorts, it's very unusual. This is my conjecture, my guess, because I don't know the details of the extradition process. But I want to reroute the discussion slightly to the domestic aspect, because it's very important. Turkey has a very long history of unfortunately successful coups, right? Some people trace it back to the 15th century, some trace it back to the coup against Abdulaziz, one of the 19th century sultans. Definitely the early 20th century coups, the coup that brought Committee of Union and Progress to power in 1913, unopposed for 5 years when they took the Ottoman Empire to its final world war. And then, of course, many coups during the Republican period. Most of them successful, 60, 80. Very few of them, like the 1962, 63, unsuccessful, but those were very minor incidents. Now, this is a turning point because the popular mobilization through which the coup failed, and many observers, especially outside of Turkey, tend to undermine this. It wasn't only some sort of split within the military. That also existed. But the popular mobilization always serves as a deterrent also for, those who are undecided about joining the coup or not joining the coup, to decide against joining the coup. So popular mobilization was critical for defeating the coup, and it is the first instance of that, which means that now, from 2016 onwards, any element that thinks about staging another coup has to think 3, 4, 5 times, because the bar is very, very high. Right? So whereas in the past they could have said, well, it has been tried 3, 4, 5 times, and every time.
You mean by the bar, you mean the risks?
The risk for any coup plotter from now on, or anything that resembles a coup.
So my final question to you is it likely to ever happen again?
We can never say it's impossible, and I wouldn't, because as I mentioned, there are many instances in world history. We just talked about Afghanistan. I mean, the Babrak Karmal, it wasn't a military coup, it was a partisan revolutionary communist takeover that's aided by some armed elements. But there can always be fringe elements that extremely overestimate their likelihood of success. They have, let's say, 1% popular support or base, and that is more or less what the Gülenist network was, 0.5% or 1%, based on the 2015 election results. Right, so a faction, a group that is maybe 0.5%, 1% of the population might really have a very inflated sense of its likelihood of success and could do it. Okay. But then, failure would be almost overdetermined, and that's why this failure of the coup is a turning point in civil-military relations in Turkey. And hopefully it's also, it's already beginning because the coup was preceded, as you remember, by years of videotapes, illegal, people's private lives, leaking of private information, complete invasion of privacy, almost as in a totalitarian state by the Gülenist organization, to redesign political parties, to wreck people's professional, business, and family lives, and so on and so forth. And this has evaporated, destroyed interpersonal trust in society, and it made it almost in that society of fear where Gülenists were tapping the phones and private homes of people. Yeah, okay. It made it exceedingly difficult to build a liberal, democratic, kind of pluralist social order.
Sener Akturk, thank you very much for coming on. I do appreciate your analysis.